The Political Economy of Human Rights, so authored by Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman, and published in 2 volumes, in 1979, is a critique of U.S. foreign policy and the role of media in shaping public perceptions of human rights issues. The authors argue that human rights are often manipulated as a tool for advancing geopolitical and economic interests, rather than being a genuine concern of state actors. Through detailed case studies and analyses, Chomsky and Herman expose the hypocrisy and selectivity in how human rights are promoted and defended by the U.S. and its allies. The 2 volumes, The Washington Connection and Third World Fascism, and After the Cataclysm, Post-War Indochina, and the Reconstruction of Imperial Ideology, focus on different aspects of U.S. interventionism and the global impact of American policies. In the first volume, Chomsky and Herman explore the nexus between U.S. foreign policy and human rights abuses, particularly in the Third World. They argue that U.S. support for authoritarian regimes, often justified in the name of anti-communism, has led to widespread repression, torture, and mass killings. The authors highlight how these regimes, despite their brutality, are labeled as moderate or friendly by the U.S. government, as long as they serve American interests. Chomsky and Herman emphasize the concept of subordination as central to understanding U.S. foreign policy. They argue that the U.S. seeks to maintain a global order that prioritizes its economic and strategic interests, even at the cost of supporting regimes that violate human rights. This subordination is achieved through various means, including economic aid, military support, and diplomatic backing for repressive governments. A key theme of the first volume is the double standard in how the U.S. and its allies approach human rights issues. Chomsky and Herman point out that human rights abuses committed by enemies of the U.S. are highlighted and condemned, often leading to calls for intervention or sanctions. In contrast, similar or worse abuses by U.S.-backed regimes are downplayed, ignored, or justified. The authors discuss several case studies to illustrate this double standard, including U.S. support for the military dictatorships in Latin America, particularly in countries like Chile, Argentina, and Guatemala. They show how the U.S. provided material and moral support to these regimes, which were responsible for widespread atrocities, including the disappearance and murder of political opponents, labor activists, and indigenous people. Chomsky and Herman also examine the role of the media in perpetuating these double standards. They argue that mainstream media in the U.S. often serves as a propaganda tool for the state, selectively reporting on human rights abuses in a way that aligns with U.S. foreign policy objectives. The media's focus on enemy states' abuses, while ignoring or excusing those committed by U.S. allies, contributes to a skewed understanding of global human rights issues. The authors introduce the concept of worthy and unworthy victims to describe how media coverage differs depending on whether the victims are in countries allied with or opposed to the U.S. For example, victims of repression in Soviet-aligned countries are given extensive coverage and portrayed sympathetically, while victims of U.S. US-backed regimes receive little attention or are framed in a negative light, the second volume shifts focus to Southeast Asia, specifically the aftermath of the Vietnam War and the US's role in shaping the post-war narrative. Chomsky and Herman analyze the devastation caused by U.S. military intervention in Indochina, including Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. They argue that the U.S. media and intellectual establishment have engaged in a campaign to rewrite the history of the war, minimizing American culpability and exaggerating the atrocities committed by the victorious communist forces. The authors contend that this revisionist history serves to rehabilitate U.S. foreign policy and justify future interventions. By focusing on the human rights abuses of the communist regimes in Vietnam and Cambodia, while downplaying the US's role in causing widespread destruction and suffering, the media and intellectuals help to restore the legitimacy of American power. A significant portion of the second volume is dedicated to the analysis of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, which came to power after the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. The authors do not deny the atrocities committed by the Khmer Rouge, but criticize the way these events were used to advance a particular ideological agenda. They argue that the horrors of the Khmer Rouge were exaggerated by Western media and used to discredit not only the Cambodian regime, but also the broader communist movement in Southeast Asia. Chomsky and Herman compare the extensive coverage of Khmer Rouge atrocities with the relative silence on the U.S.-backed bombing of Cambodia during the Vietnam War, which contributed to the destabilization of the country and the rise of the Khmer Rouge. They suggest that the focus on the Khmer Rouge's crimes served to divert attention from the U.S.'s responsibility for the broader catastrophe in Indochina. In the final chapters, Chomsky and Herman discuss how the post-war narrative of Indochina has been used to reconstruct and reinforce imperial ideology. They argue that the portrayal of the U.S. as a benevolent power, seeking only to defend freedom and democracy, has been restored, despite the evidence of widespread atrocities and failures in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This reconstructed narrative helps to legitimize future interventions by framing them as necessary actions to protect human rights and counter totalitarian threats. The authors emphasize that this reconstruction of ideology is not merely an academic exercise, but has real-world implications. By rehabilitating the image of U.S. power, the state is able to continue its global interventions with public support, often under the guise of promoting human rights and democracy.